let me start by introducing myself. I'm Rob Cohen. I work with companies like 2U, Stride, Kids to Pros, Learning Mate. I've been in education for about 40 years. I've started a bunch of companies, so I'm no stranger to innovation or regulation. And it's my belief that regulation serves a necessary evil. It's useful to stop bad actors, but to me personally, without a doubt, it can get in the way of innovation, and oftentimes we have to work around regulation, not with it. I have a bunch of panelists here to talk about that today. I think the topic is especially relevant. There are a bunch of rule changes that you may be aware of at the Department of Education that are directly going at what I think is a pretty critical business model. My four panelists have great stories and a history of having to do a lot of what I did, so let's just dive in. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about their background, and maybe something fun about themselves to perk us up. Pramath?
Thank you, Robert. I'm here from India, so I'll talk mostly about regulations in India, which may or may not be relevant to a lot of you here. But my background is that I've been very involved in setting up new higher education programs and universities. I've been involved with more than a dozen such projects, ranging from countries like Malaysia to most recently Nigeria, though most of the projects I've been involved in are in India. Two of the most prominent ones are the Indian School of Business, which within a very short period of time became the top private business school in India and one of the top 20 programs in the world, as well as a new liberal arts university called Ashoka University, which I founded with a bunch of friends about 15 years ago. One of the alums is here, who's an education entrepreneur now. And I also now run an ed tech firm in my own capacity, which focuses on teaching leadership and power skills online. A fun fact is that I'm a failed academic. I did a PhD many years ago in engineering, in robotics and AI, by the way, about 35 years ago. But I did really want to go back to India, and at that time there were no real opportunities for the kind of academic training I had. So to the disappointment of my PhD advisor and a lot of my academic colleagues, I sold out to the world of business and didn't ever realize that I would be back in academia in a very different capacity. So that's my fun fact. Should I?
We'll come back.
We'll come back, right?
Barbara?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Barbara Mistick. I'm president of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. Independent meaning the nation's private nonprofit colleges. There are 1,700 of them in 396 of the 435 congressional districts. So that might be surprising to all of you. We really do think of ourselves as representing college towns across America, and America is really a nation of college towns. So we feel that we're not only a critical contributor to the talent pool for our nation, but also to the economy and so many of the communities in which we are located. I've had kind of a checkered past too. I might say I'm an accidental academic. So I entered into the academy via entrepreneurship. I previously had a number of businesses that I started and eventually sold, and then ended up as in an entrepreneurship advising capacity, and then taught entrepreneurship at Carnegie Mellon University, and that's led me to a range of other things. But I realized that in the academy, when you go from being an academic teacher to the administration side, they say you've crossed over. But I've recently found out that when you go from being a campus president, which is what I was right before I came to the role at NICU, when you cross over into this side on policy and lobbying, it is the dark, dark side. So I'm happy to be with you from the dark side today.
Denis?
Hi, I'm Denis Ryan, 2U's Executive Vice President of Compliance and Regulatory Affairs. I've been with 2U 13 years now. Prior to that, I worked for a for-profit in Orlando, Florida, a Full Sail University, which is a big kind of entertainment media school. I ran their compliance department and their reaccreditation process. And for about 10 years prior to that, I was a practicing attorney in New York City. Fun fact, so I was born in New York City. I was also a very large, chubby baby. And I was selected by Pampers to be their national campaign baby for about a year. So I'm on boxes and print all over the place. So try to keep that out of your mind while I'm talking about regulations.
Vince, top that.
No way I'm topping that. 0. Vince Sampson, special counsel at Cooley out of our Washington, D.C. office. Prior to joining Cooley, I've had a couple of other jobs, including being Deputy Assistant Secretary for Higher Education Policy in the Bush administration, serving under Secretary Margaret Spellings. I wish I had close to a fun fact as that, but I think I'm pretty good at my job, and I benchmark that by the fact I've gotten yelled at and almost thrown out of both Republican and Democratic offices in the House and the Senate. So I think I'm either doing very well or very poorly. I'm going to take the former, not the latter.
You know, I wasn't going to share a fun fact, but while Pramath was calling himself a failed academic, my son, who's in the front row, was laughing because I'm truly a failed academic. I started my first company in college, dropped out, and was going to go back if the business didn't succeed, and I never got to go back. So that's my fun fact. Pramath, so you've started both not-for-profit and for-profit companies in India. You're no stranger to regulation there. Describe the regulatory environment, because my hunch is folks here don't know it, and how you had to approach doing what you did given that.
So in higher ed, if you're setting up a new institution or running an institution, you have to necessarily be non-profit if you're offering degrees. And you need approval to start a new institution. So the focus is on much more on regulating the entry into the field. There are lots of rules around how you need to operate, and you are supposed to follow those rules, but honestly, the government is not able to, in fact, implement a lot of their regulations, which means that people go rogue once they enter or are allowed to enter, which means that they don't deliver the quality they promise, that students are misled. And of course, then the government further regulates. So we are caught in this vicious cycle of very tight and onerous regulations. As far as the higher education institutions in the brick and mortar, in-person world is concerned. This is yet coupled by the fact that there's massive mismatch in supply and demand. So the opportunity to build new institutions is massive. Our gross enrollment ratio in India is only 25%, so only 1 in 4 adults gets to go to college. And there's much greater demand, which is why you see so many young people coming outside India, including the United States, to study. So despite these regulations, people keep setting up new institutions and opening new institutions because there's such great demand, and you work with the constraints. To your point, in my case, the first institution we set up, which I mentioned, has become famous all over the world now. We ended up bypassing the regulation. And just to give you a quick snapshot of what it was, if you set up an MBA program in India, you had to go to this particular body you could set up a standalone institution just doing MBA, but you needed to get regulatory approval for that MBA. But there was no room for innovation in that model. You had to basically, they would even tell you that you have to start with 60 students, and we'll tell you when you can go beyond 60 based on how you perform. So even the number of students you can take is regulated. And so we decided that, and we wanted to do a one-year program. They had no model for a one-year program. So we created an 11-month program which allowed us to fly under the regulatory radar, but that allowed us to actually innovate as much as we wanted. And I don't want to get into the details of the innovation, but that's what led to our international rankings. Interestingly, we are now accredited by 3 of the top management education accreditors around the world. So the irony is that you are running an institution that has been around for 20 years, that doesn't fall under the purview of any regulation, but by students and employers is considered equivalent to a management master's, and is accredited by the ASU+GSV, which is the American body for accreditation, and 2 European bodies, which is technically called earning the triple crown in the world of management education, if you will. And yet you are outside the purview, and we've been doing this for 20 years. We've had 2 presidents, 3 prime ministers, 1 US president, all be part of being on campus, awarding our certificates. So that's a unique example, but it's also something that I can give more examples of how people have bypassed the regulation, especially when offering high-quality programs, because the high-quality innovative programs would never fly if you actually complied with the regulation. I'm not even getting into the online side of things, and maybe later on in the discussion we can get into it.
So just to tie it back to our topic, the solution for innovation in India is to work around all the regulations. And I think that may be a theme you kind of get through the presentation. Barbara, you have a unique perspective because you represent the universities here. How does the uncertainty of the current environment affect them?
Well, I'd say particularly in comparison to India, we're in a much higher level regulatory environment. So it's pretty impossible to start an institution without going through a regulatory process to kind of fly under the radar. But I think we're in a different spot today. Coming out of the pandemic, during the pandemic, we spent a lot of our time working with Congress directly for the entire higher ed ecosystem, and we're fortunate to have congressional support, the higher education emergency relief funds that came to all the sectors of higher education. But today, we are really post that environment and working in what is a very regulatory agenda. So I think part of that happens because we work not just with the congressional branch, but also with the administrative branches. And I think what you see today is it takes a long time for the administrative branches to work through the process that they have internally to put new regulations in place. So a lot of that can take somewhere between one and a half to 2 years. There's a notification process, there's a review process, a comment process. And so now we're at this point where it's fast and furious amount of regulations coming out. So if you're in the middle of the American higher ed system today, you're feeling a little pressure on the regulatory front. And despite all of this process, there are a number of things that are coming out that have some mixed unintended consequences. A good example of that is the new FAFSA regulations. So FAFSA is the federal student aid form that every college student has to fill out coming into the academy. And Congress, in their wisdom, in 2021, in the year-end bill, where there was a supplemental funding for COVID funds in that bill too, there was a provision to really honor an outgoing senator with a FAFSA simplification. Just this idea that this is something that he'd worked for a long time and wanted to see that. But at the same time, so it's the idea that this is a good idea. Everybody's in favor of FAFSA simplification. I don't I don't see any hands jumping up to say no, no, no. But there are always unintended consequences. So there's a Brookings report out this week that shows that while there are more students eligible, and they'll be eligible for more aid in the range of about $3.7 billion, it also points out that there are going to be students and families that are going to suffer as well. So there are some things that have been taken away in this simplification process. If you have two children in school, for example, and those unintended consequences to those families are going to cost about $3.7 billion. So it's kind of a wash at the end of the day from a monetary perspective, but a tremendous impact on families. And sometimes those things come from Congress, sometimes they come regulatorily. I know we're going to talk a little bit about third-party servicers, so you'll see that from the department's perspective too. But I think overall it is it makes it frustrating because it's very difficult for the ecosystem, even the various sectors of the ecosystem, to have input, particularly on some of the things that come down from Congress. It's also very hard when the department either overreaches or implements something that does have unintended consequences. And there is so much complexity. I mean, we have thousands of people here at this conference and hundreds of sessions. It just, you just get a sense of the complexity of the education marketplace. And so the regulatory side, while important, also can really slow down the process and slow down innovation as well.
Thank you. Denis, you work for 2U that works with 38 of the world's top 50 universities, but I think it's fair to say that the business model is a little bit under attack by the Department of Education. It's not specific to 2U, but across the industry. But let's talk about some of the stuff that's going on. One, bundled services. What are the regulations around this? It's the one that's about to start, and what might change and why is that an issue?
Sure. So I appreciate you speaking about unintended consequences. Certainly that's something I think will come up as it relates to third-party servicers. But in talking about bundled services, it's really kind of a clarification to the statute on incentive compensation. Incentive compensation effectively says that you can't incentivize people that are involved in recruiting. So you can't incentivize them for success in enrollment-related activity. And bundled services is currently sort of clarified in what they call like sub-regulatory guidance, so a Dear Colleague letter. The current one was put in place in 2011, and what that effectively says is companies working with universities can share tuition revenue if they're providing recruiting services, as long as they're also providing a bundle of other services, things like student support services, technology services, placement services. So that's really sort of the business model under which a lot of ed tech companies are providing services to universities. That's been in place long before the most recent Dear Colleague letter in 2011. There were safe harbors prior to that that sort of specified the same thing that's in the existing Dear Colleague letter. So it's really sort of the business model has spanned, I guess, effectively like 5 administrations in 20 plus something years. And that's kind of how we operate, as 2U. We share revenue with our university partners, and we provide a suite of services to those partners that includes things like technology support, student support, placement.
So what might happen with that?
So, so both, I think, the bundled services third-party servicer issues kind of date back to the same notice from the department, which came out February 15th. And what they said about bundled services was they intended to review bundled services as a result of sort of the expansion of the market over the years since 2011. They wanted to revisit the guidance and potentially update it to make it a little more current. So what they did was they scheduled sort of a procedural set of listening sessions and written comments. The listening sessions occurred kind of, I guess, around the beginning of March, and the comment period ended sometime in the middle of March. I believe there were somewhere around 200-300 written comments submitted, many by universities, by ACE, of which I think NICU signed on as well to their letter. And The vast majority, I think something like 84%, were in favor of sort of keeping revenue share and bundled services in place, although there certainly are areas where I think it could be updated since it was last issued in 2011. So we're sort of in this period now where the department has received those comments and are sort of examining them and trying to figure out how best to appropriately update the Dear Colleague letter.
I think it's fair to say that over the last 20 years, hundreds of universities around the country have fostered innovation through this bundled services rule, and I think what we're all afraid of is the Department of Education saying, yeah, this is a great way to innovate, so we're going to turn it off so you can't do that anymore. I'm not sure who that benefits, but I want to move on to the one that's taken a...
Can I just add a little color before you jump there? Because essentially it wasn't just about bundled services. There were institutions, we had members who had up to 300 what would be third-party service agreements. So if you had students on study abroad, that was a third-party service agreement. If you had a scholarship program that came into your institution, that was a third-party agreement. So it's, part of there were actually 1,000 letters that went into the department.
Talking about bundled services, not
I
third-party
know.
services.
So the third-party services was just huge, and for many of us, we felt like it was an overreach. To ask institutions to go back to providing all of those services would have been is literally impossible. And once institutions got the sense of the scope of the reach, it was, someone said to me, it was like trying to gather up, the net was so wide, it was like trying to gather up every fish in every ocean around so that you would have to go back to a model where you provided everything directly. And we're so far past that now. So I think that's in my, and for me, that's in that box of complexity and understanding that complexity and having the department fully understand what that means to all of the, the 5,000 institutions of higher education. Yeah.
Denis, do you want to get into the weeds a little bit and talk about the third-party services regulation so people understand what's going on?
Yeah, sure. So,
maybe even recent events.
Yep. So along with that notice in February, they also issued a new set of, basically a new Dear Colleague letter on third-party servicers. And I think what maybe surprised everybody, and just to kind of like set the stage, last year there were a set of negotiated rulemaking topics that were brought forth. One of them was third-party servicers, there's accreditation, there's distance education, there's state authorization, amongst a few others, but those are probably the bigger of the ones issued that are kind of apply to our sector. So I think maybe the sector, the higher ed industry, schools, companies, ed tech companies, were sort of presuming the department would go through the negotiated rulemaking process, and that has procedural requirements and timing requirements, and negotiators are involved, and language is sort of issued and debated, and what caught everyone by surprise, I think, in February 15th was the department issued a new Dear Colleague letter that basically said, this is effective immediately. At that time, the compliance date was May 1st. There was a post-effective date written comment period, which procedurally is a little wonky, that they didn't receive comments before issuing the guidance. And what they effectively did, so third-party servicer, like the statute basically, it's very specific to administering Title IV financial aid. And it historically has always been very specific to that, including subsequent guidance that came out over the years. So it caught everyone, I think, by surprise that they would issue guidance, they would issue a new Dear Colleague letter while there's a rulemaking process coming up. And that guidance sort of expanded into all these different areas of services, recruitment, student retention, like instructional areas. So like it was...
There was nothing that wasn't included. Is that closer to the truth?
I've heard somebody say, like, if you even breathe near a school, you're effectively a third-party servicer. So like, I mean, I think that's the truth of what happened was it sort of captured an entire industry by surprise. And as Barbara mentioned, the schools were caught off guard, the ed tech companies were caught off guard.
And if you were a foreign individual breathing near a school, that was especially bad, right?
Yeah, so I mean, the restriction on foreign entities made sense in the past. It existed prior because if you think about it, you didn't want a foreign entity like administering federal funds for the US government. That made sense. But when you think about it in the scheme of like foreign companies that are in the ed tech space and may consult with other companies and provide sort of wraparound services, it really did not make sense. And there are companies like Pearson, that's a UK registered company. For a moment, they thought maybe like, okay, now we can't work with Title IV institutions in the US. So it created a lot of chaos. So I think what effectively happened after that was ACE wrote a letter to the department. A number of other associations, thank you, Barbara, signed on. And they made it clear that, one, the time frame for compliance was too short, and two, the complexity is fairly overwhelming when you think about like every technology company that a university works with would now have to sort of register as a third-party servicer. They'd have to have independent audits. They're now joint and severally liable with their contractor or the school, and there were sort of all these requirements that everybody hadn't had enough time to sort of grasp. So what effectively happened after that was, after the ACE letter, the department sort of reissued new guidance, or sort of updated their existing guidance and said, okay, the new effective date is September 1st. We're going to allow schools and companies to have more time to get into compliance. And then subsequent to that, there was a written comment period. Barbara mentioned there were thousands of comments submitted, overwhelmingly against issuing this guidance for third-party servicers. And following that, I should probably disclose to you, filed a lawsuit.
I wasn't going to ask.
Against the Department of Education, and we just felt they had not followed the proper administrative procedures. The expansion of definition of third-party servicer, was beyond the scope of the original statute, which is very specific to administration of Title IV funds. So following that, a week later, the Department of Ed released on a blog, strangely, not a new issued.
This is a brand new way to do policy by blog.
So, if guidance is if DCL is sub-regulatory guidance, a department blog, talking about that as sub-regulatory education blog. So I'm not quite sure what to make of that, but what they did was they rolled back the effective date. They said, there is no effective date at the moment. They're going to re-examine all the comments. They provided additional updates for things like foreign entities, study abroad programs, saying they're not going to be covered in the new final guidance to be issued. And they said they're kind of revisiting a number of the areas of expansion to kind of like figure out how to narrow the scope. But the one thing I think they have maybe insinuated or at least left out intentionally is recruiting as being one of those services that seems to still very much be on the table that would qualify somebody as a third-party servicer, at least in their mind. I still think that's beyond the scope of the statute. And so we're kind of in this place now where we're waiting for them to issue new final regulatory guidance that may be narrower in scope, but may still sort of capture a lot of companies that provide recruiting services or other types of services, depending on what the issue.
I promise not to ask you to guess which way it's going to turn out. So Vince, I tried really hard to see if I could get someone from the DOE to come up. They didn't. So I have a question for you. You used to work for the DOE, and I think actually this is a critical question around the regulatory process, and especially as it relates to now. What the hell were they thinking?
Sweet, I'm glad I get the easy question. So I think we need to take a step back, and I think you've heard some very interesting commentary and feedback on a particular set of regulatory guidance in the process. But the one thing I want folks to think about is there's like 3 Ps that guide all of this regulatory output. It's politics, policy, and process. Right, and it's not sequential. Not one necessarily drives the other. We kind of think about it like a triangle, in a sense. And those things all come to bear on the decision making at both the department level, and always remember that the department there's other equities involved. The White House is involved when it comes to spending money. It's our money, and it also belongs to the U.S. Treasury, so they have a role to play. So I know that people like to take pot shots at the department, and maybe sometimes it's fair. When they took shots at me, that was fair. But I also wanted folks to know that they don't stand isolated, right? There's a activity there. And there's another issue, I think I call it kind of the tension between the articles, Article 1 and Article 2. If you recall, the last reauthorization of the Higher Education Act was 2008. Maybe that was my fun fact. If you look, there's a set of regulatory stuff that comes out. I signed it. That was a long time ago. Clearly, if we stepped outside of this room, you'd see a lot has changed since 2008. So we have a static statute, and the really only way to address innovation, positively or negatively, is going to be through the regulatory process. Then you have to overlay that the department's process is cumbersome. If anyone wants to meet me in the lobby bar, I'll give you my off-the-record thoughts about negotiated rulemaking. I think it's a great premise. I think it is somewhat fallen by the wayside, not necessarily for this administration. You can even go back to when I was there. But it's a very tough and time-consuming process, as Barbara mentioned. So the department is stuck, in a sense, trying to interpret and capture what's happening out in the field with the tools that it has. And some of the tools that they have are sub-regulatory guidance. The unfortunate piece is that it doesn't ascribe to the same regulatory framework, right? The notice and comment, this one was very interesting on this, on the third-party servicer and bundled services guidance. They did kind of a notice and comment thing. They don't have to do that. But once they do it, now they've kind of opened themselves up to a new set of questions, like why did you do that? So the department, I can feel that tension happening there. And the last thing I would say is what has made this challenging is the communication with stakeholders has become very difficult, both at the congressional level and at the departmental level. And when you you typically plug those into that triangle, you can get a better sense of why things turned out. So, the premise of the question is like, why did they do what they did? I think they are taking a piece of policy that was communicated from stakeholders, layering on a little bit of politics, and using the best process that they thought they have to get this done. I think that's kind of the short answer, long form version to your question.
I want to answer the question, but I'm just going to ask this to the group. Do we think they got the process right this time?
I mean, I'll start. I don't think they did. I don't think they did. Now, and again, I say this knowing that understanding kind of why they did what they did and how they did what they did, but I don't think that's the best process. And I don't think, kind of grafting on a public comment piece on the back end really serves the purpose of what the administrative process is supposed to be. If again, my feelings aside on negotiated rulemaking, the kind of foundational premise is that you're taking comments from all of the stakeholders, and we can debate in recent past if we've had all the right stakeholders at the table, and that thing has gone on. That conversation has happened for the past 20 years, at least that I've been around it. But the fact of the matter is you have stakeholders at the table informing the department as best they can, even if they don't reach consensus, about what that ultimate regulation should look like. This thing, the DCL, the EA, the electronic announcement, because I'm from Washington, so we speak in these little stupid terms. The Dear Colleague letter, the electronic announcement, the blog post, which is now, again, becomes precedential, so we should always be looking for blog posts from administrations succeeding this one, is, I think, a dangerous way to regulate, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. Obviously, I don't feel like they followed the right process, but I think people presume that if they just go through the rulemaking process, that somehow that process solves the issue, right? And the reality is, they can't just take the same sort of expansion of the definition that they've put out in the guidance and put it in the rulemaking, and by virtue of going through the rulemaking procedurally, then it's fine, because it still has to be consistent with the underlying statute. So whatever the rulemaking process is, we haven't seen that language yet. I'm guessing that will come out sometime in September, October. It likely means they will not meet sort of the procedural deadline of issuing final language by November 1st, which then likely means this rulemaking will not be effective until July 1, 2025. So it feels like the issuance of the DCL and the guidance was sort of a stopgap to put something in place between, now, so that they can sort of proceed under that guidance up until the point when the rulemaking eventually becomes effective.
So Denis and Vince have both mentioned the negotiated public rulemaking, and it is an important process, and it is a way to have a deeper conversation about these topics that are not, not broadly discussed. But at the same time, it's important who's at the table, and that has, there's been conversation about are all of the right stakeholders at the table for each of those negotiated public rulemaking sessions. And then, because there's been frustration about not everybody being at the table, now they've layered on additional comment periods. And then I think we're in a period where the politics doesn't have an equal P, Vince. I think it has maybe a bigger P. And so what you see are things like borrower defense. And now you see borrower defense, really playing out in a Supreme Court case that we're waiting to hear the outcome of later this year. So you've got, the administration, essentially the White House, weighing in on a policy issue that, should have gone through a process. There's debate at the congressional level, does the secretary have the authority? I think we're in this period where that politics piece is capitalized and not in an equal third with those other two. And so it's changing all of these pieces. And the danger in it, like if you look at the piece about student debt, you're playing with 43 million Americans who have some eligibility for it. And they're now in the middle of that political process, and they're in the middle of something that didn't go through all of the other processes that are available and exist for both the department and others to implement. So, yeah.
Barbara, I think that's right. I mean, if you think about again, this is a little bit off topic, but the student debt issue that is now sitting before the Supreme Court, right? The policy had been discussed among members of Congress, candidates when they were running, so there was no surprise that this was going to happen, right, in some form or fashion. But then politics did get involved, and it led to I think, another bad process, right? You had the department, and we had people writing, former colleagues of mine who believed that there was not this administrative authority to write it. You had this kind of questionable note from the Speaker of the House saying this is Congress's job, and they are party aligned with the administration. So I think when the department came to want to affect the policy and react to stakeholders who were promoting that policy, they were left with a bad process. And to me, it felt like they kind of rolled the dice, right? And I honestly have been in conversations where the department knows, and it goes back several years and several topics, that they know that litigation is likely or certainly an option. And I think they felt like it was going to be in this case. I don't know if they identified exactly what the point was going to come, or the plaintiffs who were going to arise, if they could beat that standing issue. But I just think that you're right, when we got into like a heavily political argument for a policy that was relatively well known, you ended up with a bad process. And I think that's why we're sitting waiting for Supreme Court.
Let me just jump in because we're a little bit short on time. Barbara, I want to completely agree with you. Vince, I thought the 3 Ps were going to be politics, politics, and politics. You surprised me when there were actually other Ps. We have a very short amount of time. I have a quick question, which might have quick answers, but I hope not. Is there, around this world of regulation and the way it controls us, is there anything we like, or are there parts of it that we think help universities and help students and help companies innovate? Someone say something.
Well, I think you can't go wrong if you put students first. I think that's a really good bar to think about in this process. And so, if you can take a look at what's out there and have a, I think we have to have a reasonable agenda of what we can solve. I honestly believe it is possible to solve at this moment in time debt-free undergraduate education. And so, I think there are mechanisms in place. The double Pell, which has been a big push and affects students in every single sector, would make a huge amount of difference. But it's, gathering, there's so many pieces here, it's almost impossible for us to align the different different congressional, judicial, and the administrative, executive branches to really accomplish anything. And I think that's perhaps the biggest frustration today.
And I would say putting the regulations specifically aside, the one good thing that has come out of this is hopefully for folks to understand they need to engage. They need to engage with policymakers, both at the administration and with Congress. I think that's the positive lesson here. You have to worry about the outcome and how you do the engagement, but the engagement with policymakers should be done as a matter of course. I think that is critical for folks to understand.
Pramath, I want to give you the last word if you...
No, thank you. I understand that this discussion went in a particular direction, and I'm probably the outlier here. I do think that around the world, we need to understand that education is really changing. And I'm not saying this in a cliched sort of manner, but there is a massive disruption. And for people like me and other parts of the world outside the United States, the large numbers of people that need to be educated in a very short period of time is unprecedented in human history. We have a very different problem relative to what you have. And you almost need regulations to be created from the ground up for this new world. Lifelong learning, people learning at their own pace, online learning are all going to be mainstream for us in India and other parts of the world. And I think we actually need to create regulation completely afresh rather than trying to make tweaks to what exists. Some of this might be applicable here too, I feel. But that's my last comment.
I think it likely is. Our time's run over. Thank you very much. Panel, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.